John Gartland, Director of Net 1, and Mr. Gurmukh Niote, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Director of BBNet, and Mr. Martin List-Peterson, Director of Airwire. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any submission or opening statements you've made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And I just ask members and witnesses to turn off your mobile phones or to put them onto flight mode as they interfere with our sound system. So I'll ask Mr. Matthews to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Chairperson, members of the committee, on behalf of the Regional Internet Service Providers Association, henceforth referred to as RISPA, I would like to thank you for the invitation to appear before the committee today and contribute to its discussion on the National Broadband Plan. As part of the delegation today, I am joined by several subject matter experts and representatives of RISPA members who will be answering technical questions. Just to give some background about RISPA, we are a trade association that was founded by a number of Irish-owned internet service providers, henceforth referred to as ISPs, who wish to establish an industry representative body that could provide a coherent voice for the over 40 ISPs who have been successfully delivering broadband services throughout the rural regions of Ireland for the better part of 20 years. RISPA's aim is to raise awareness of regional ISPs and address the issues that they face so that the rollout of reliable high-speed broadband services can be accelerated and delivered to rural Ireland within 2 years. In terms of RISPA's purpose in appearing before the committee today, RISPA recognises the important role that the committee serves in scrutinising all matters pertaining to communications policy and appreciates the privileged opportunity to assist the committee's examination of rural broadband issues. RISPA's appearance before the committee today is intended to help the committee's investigation of the NBP's process and provide advice about the options for accelerating the rollout of rural broadband. In support of its appearance, RISPA has provided a written submission that outlines issues relating to the NBP's process and proposes a different approach to solving Ireland's rural connectivity gap. RISPA's suggested approach is based on a hybrid model of complementary technologies and a series of proven policies that collectively represent an alternative to the NBP. RISPA intends that the information it presents to the committee will provide its members with new insights on the NBP and the best options for rolling out cost-effective and timely high-speed broadband services. In respect to the proposed NBP, RISPA has serious concerns, some of which are as follows. Accuracy of the intervention area. A recurring issue throughout the NBP's procurement process has been the mapping of premises who do not have access to a minimum 30 megabits per second broadband service. The implications of these mapping inaccuracies were most evident when 300,000 premises had to be removed from the intervention area because EIR concluded that they were commercially viable for the provision of its fibre optic broadband service. Such mapping inaccuracies were exacerbated by the fact that the intervention area failed to take into consideration the approximately 125,000 premises that are customers of regional ISPs, many of whom had already begun rolling out next-generation broadband services to rural Ireland when the procurement process began. Ultimately, the accurate mapping of the intervention area is necessary to minimise the financial burden on the state and prevent the overbuilding of infrastructure. Consequently, RISPA advocates that a real-time market monitoring system be implemented and maintained by Comreg, and that such a system would be designed to allow ISPs to demarcate the areas that they serve and provide a facility for its citizens to appeal such information. The issue of encroachment. Related to the problem of an inaccurate intervention area is the issue of the encroachment clause in the NBP's proposed contract. Such a clause would compensate the winning bidder should the number of premises in the intervention area fall below 542,000. Considering that approximately 125,000 of these premises are already customers of regional ISPs, RISPA is concerned that upon signing the NBP contract, the state may be immediately liable for the payment of large encroachment fees to the winning bidder. The potential removal of retail restrictions. A leaked aide-memoire from the Department of Communications reveals that the winning bidder is to be the retailer of last resorts. In the event that the uptake of fibre broadband services is lower than expected and the cash flow of the winning bidder suffers such that it cannot afford to build out and operate the network, RISPA believes that there will be pressure put on the department to lift the retail restriction. If this were to happen, the ISPs who retail broadband services over the network could be disadvantaged and possibly exit the market, which would leave the winning bidder in a monopoly position that would run contrary to the purpose of the NBP. EU state aid rules. RISPA notes that the EU guidelines for the development of broadband networks to correct market gaps directs that member states should limit the scale of their interventions as much as possible. The guidelines instruct member states to intervene only after the private sector has failed to deliver services commercially. Where a member state elects to intervene, the guidelines clearly state that intervention should begin with the least intrusive policy instruments, such as those described in RISPA's written submission. Only after such policy measures have failed does the EU recommend that member states consider more intrusive interventions like what is proposed with the NBP. In short, the guiding principle of the EU rules is that intervention should target market failures and not crowd out existing market operators from areas that they plan to invest in or have already made network investments. In closing, RISPA would like to state that it fully supports the laudable aim of rolling out high-speed broadband services to rural Ireland. RISPA believes that the NBP will fall considerably short of its target for 100% of premises to have access to broadband services, and that the project does not represent good value for money. RISPA would argue that the collective policies it has outlined in its written submission represent an alternative approach that would achieve the NBP's aim in 2 years instead of 7, and for a net cost to the state of 402 million compared to 2.97 billion. Consequently, RISPA advocates that the NBP's procurement process should be halted so that a comprehensive evaluation can be undertaken of the recommendations that it has outlined in its written submission, which the committee are now invited to discuss and ask questions. This concludes RISPA's opening statement, and I now yield to the Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll just start by asking you, why didn't you enter the procurement process back in 2015?
I think in terms of the way that was set up, it was for the use of licensed spectrum. That was for the wireless option. The restriction was that you had to use licensed spectrum to do that. Now, I think you guys would be more familiar with the timings of the auction. I can't remember exactly when it was, but I believe that the auction for the licensed spectrum had just passed.
Came in during and around that period for the 3.5 gig license at that time. So the two things happened in parallel, and as a result, the operators of unlicensed spectrum were excluded from taking part in the submission process at that time.
And that was the reason you didn't enter the procurement process, is that correct?
That's the reason the industry didn't enter the procurement process. I mean, obviously RISPA didn't exist as a entity back during that time. So RISPA is a new entity designed to bring the industry together to operate as a coherent voice. But there were other organisations down through the years that have repeatedly attempted to influence public policy, the process itself. And there were consultations engaged with, there were recommendations, there was paperwork filled out, options were explained to the department.
There's also another item, basically, that the 3.5 gigahertz licensed spectrum previous to the auctioning off of the spectrum, so the change which went parallel with the start of the NBP procurement process, was that each provider could apply for a 20-kilometre radius, like a chunk of Ireland. So they would buy them in the areas where they were serving, and a regional provider obviously will only serve a part of Ireland. Now, with the change of the licensing of that spectrum, all the providers that were using 3.5 gigahertz spectrum beforehand were basically booted out of that spectrum and were forced to move to unlicensed spectrum because it was not affordable for them to buy a nationwide spectrum block.
Have you consulted with Comreg in relation to on spectrum?
I personally actually expressed interest for Airwire to participate, but when the figures they were aiming at, it was way out of our budget.
What did Comreg say?
Well, there's basically it was a nationwide spectrum. It wouldn't have made any sense for us at all to participate in that.
So you consulted with Comreg, and what was their response to you?
Well, obviously we could have partaken in the bidding.
You could have.
Yeah, we could have, yes, but it was very clear from early days where we were in regards to monetary expenses. The other thing.
What do you mean by that? Sorry, could you just explain that in relation to monetary expenses?
Basically, what it would cost us to buy a block of spectrum, it wouldn't be something we could afford as a regional provider.
So just for clarity, the policy here in Ireland has been to auction spectrum nationally for the whole country, not in terms of to look at obviously with the 3.5 gig, they looked at a multi-award model which did divide up different areas, and that was quite successful, but it was still very much huge chunks of the country. So if we look at, say, for instance, the UK has obviously addressed this quite successfully, and they've implemented a use it or lose it policy of spectrum. So the mobile network operators can purchase vast blocks of spectrum to serve the urban and suburban areas they need, but in the rural areas where they don't tend to use the spectrum, what's happening then is that regional ISPs can then purchase that auction for that region to use it and serve it, which was quite a good model.
And then there's another factor that comes in, which also basically made it unfeasible for us to partake, is that there was a technology requirement set for the auction spectrum that it had to be LTE-based equipment. We didn't have the freedom of choice to use alternative transmission methods. If we were to purchase nationwide spectrum, it had to be LTE equipment, which cost a lot more than other alternative products that we can get that can achieve the same speeds or similar.
Okay. I'm going to just move to my colleagues here. Senator Tim Lombard.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to welcome our witnesses here today for the National Broadband Plan debate regarding where we're going. We've had witnesses come forth, in particular from the Department, and they spoke about broadband and that it's going to be the game changer for the next 20, 30 years. Could I ask about the actual speeds that you would be actually providing going forward? We've had presentations from the Department on about e-learning, e-farming, e-health, major changes, major speeds required. Where would you fit your criteria regarding the speeds required, and would you be happy that this technology would have the potential to provide those speeds?
Yeah, on page 2 of our written submission, we've given a sort of evolution of broadband radio technology, we talk about. I'm just looking here. I could have given the wrong page, but we talk about in 2012 it was say 30 megabits, and we talk about the jumps that it's experienced. And we're now at, in terms of the products themselves, are rated for 200 megabits per second, and some of the members here actually have connections installed that are doing that in license-exempt bands, which are noisy. In terms of the evolution of the long-range technology, by 2025, the prediction is 500 megabits per second in terms of long-range, multiple premises from the same site. At the moment, in terms of the short range, there's a new category has come out of broadband radio technology, which is a short range technology which allows premises to be linked together. It's like laying wireless fibre would be the easiest way to describe it. And they operate at around about 1 gigabits per second. Now next year, in the second quarter of next year, that technology is going to become multi-gigabit, so 3.5 gigabits per second. So basically, if you have strings of houses and they're within a reasonable distance to each other, you can actually install these radio units, and you can.
You're just basically bouncy, are you?
It's technically it's a mesh networking technology. So they all interlink with each other. It's exactly like a fibre cable. If you lay a fibre cable and you're passing all the homes are all connected to the same fibre cable and they're sharing that same bandwidth. So what these multi-gigabit broadband radios do is exactly the same thing, except they don't need the wire. That's basically how it works. So in terms of the evolution of speed, we're already seeing multi-gigabit products coming now. Admittedly, it's a category of shorter range radio technology, but on the long range, we're already up to 200, and that's the conservative estimate is 500 by 2025. I do remember when I was before the PAC committee, there was discussions about this in terms of wireless, and I heard figures of 20 gigabits a second. I would tend to stick very close to hard research that I would trust, and that figure of 500 of 2025 is very realistic. So that's kind of the evolution of where we're going. We have an appendice in the back where you can see specifications that are under development, and the fastest specification at the moment is just over 10 gigabits per second. So in terms of the short range, we are seeing huge speeds. Now, to transfer that into the longer range radios takes time, but in terms of where it's going and based on the technology shifts that we've experienced, there's no reason that trend and trajectory won't continue.
And your technology is made up of site-of-line mainly, isn't it? It's
the technology, if it's line of sight, that depends on which spectrum you can avail of. So yes, if you operate in 5 gigahertz, it's line of sight. If you operate in 3.5 gigahertz, there is technology around that is near line of sight, so it will cope with certain impairments. If you go down into spectrum around, let's say the radio spectrum, like 700 megahertz or the likes, then you're talking non-line of sight. Like in the US, there is a unlicensed spectrum in the 928 megahertz band. They didn't roll out GSM in 900; they rolled it out in 850. They actually started with 1900. So fixed wireless operators in the States are operating in 928 megahertz, non-line of sight, to provide broadband to customers.
And on the current spectrum you're working on, it is basically line of sight as far as I'm concerned. Like on the environmental footing, trying to ensure you have ensure you have that line of sight to every property in Ireland. What would be the environmental impacts of making sure that will happen?
You can never say you will cover every premise, but basically you will have to look at every individual scenario, and the way that we operate today with fixed wireless technologies is that we have multiple base stations or repeaters that will basically, if you can't get a premise from one place, you get it from another. You have to have multiple options, because otherwise, yeah.
Just to come in on that, so in our model, what we were doing was we were trying to build the most stress tested conservative model for coverage that we could. So we actually reduced the distances in terms of those sites down to just below 6 kilometres. Now, when you get down to those distances, the likelihood that you will not have line of sight, or the likelihood you won't be able to cover somebody, is very low. We also discussed in our submission the importance of allocating the correct spectrum bands. So we've discussed allocating low band 700 megahertz, which is non-line of sight, as you've just heard, and allocating something in the mid band to 2.0.
And what infrastructure would you need for that now? Like, obviously you can use like mass and all that scenario. How would you cover it regarding?
So this is kind of the difference with broadband radio technology. It tends to be small sites, micro sites. So this idea of mass, and I think Germic has set up an actual broadband radio unit, and you can see how small they are. So in terms of what regional ISPs do, they don't tend to be on hilltops with big massive tower masts. They tend to be on a high point in a local rural area. That could be a farmer's shed on top of a hill. It could be as simple as that. But again, it's a different type of technology. It's not the same as, say, cellular, which requires those high sites, and they're trying to cover a larger distance doing it. So the redundancy built into both broadband radio technology and in terms of the model that we're talking about is multifold, because you have small distances from the sites to the premises. That's your first aspect of redundancy. And then because of that, you have, as Martin was saying, you have multiple different angles, therefore, because of the distances from the units themselves. So it is different in terms of the number of sites we calculated, and again, we were just looking at covering the entire land mass of Ireland. It was a simple, very rudimentary calculation, but we came up with 795 sites based on that model. So
a large chunk of those sites are not known to Comrec because they are not used by your average operators, mobile operators. A lot of the regional providers operate on completely different subset of smaller repeaters. And it's both for budgetary reason, but also because we are happy enough providing areas, even if there's only 40 or 160 or 300 customers there. But then we can't use a traditional mast. Never mind the cost on getting access to a traditional mast.
Okay, so the masts are usually of your own making, or?
They are basically agreements that we have locally with people in local rural areas that were as much interested in broadband as everybody else. So they basically individual agreements where we have basically built our own masts. But they are not, usually not other providers on there.
And yeah.
So just to bring it back around to your original question, which was what infrastructure will be required. So again, you're talking about the base station units themselves, and then you're talking about a hybrid mixture of backhaul broadband radios, which are slightly larger, but they bulk transport data from the site to the nearest access point. In some cases, if you have a particularly large number of premises in a given area, you would run a fibre to that site. And that's sort of the beauty of the model. What we're talking about is fibre extensions, not building huge swaths of network infrastructure. So if you bring one fibre extension into the right geographical area, you can then load on multiple broadband radio sites, and each one of them could have 160, 200 customers on it. So very quickly you can cover a huge number of premises at these next generation access speeds that we're talking about in a much more flexible and efficient way. So in terms of infrastructure, it's very scalable. That's the simple answer. So you're not digging up every road. You're doing several fibre extensions, and then you're using the technology that you can see behind us, which you can put up in an afternoon. You can connect to home in 2 hours in terms of the antenna that goes on it. You can see the antenna at the top of the stand, and that's it. That's the sum total of it, and you can run all your broadband services over the top of that. So your internet, high-speed internet access, your telephone service, television, whatever you want. So that's the sum total of the infrastructure.
Just my last question just follows on from what the chairman asked regarding you never got involved in the process in 2015. The barriers that you found in that process, the other three who originally started in that process all were going fibre to the home. You would have a very different model, totally different from the other three itself. If the process was reopened, would you come on board regarding re-tendering, or do you think the process is moved on to the actual fibre itself?
I mean, the process would have to be fundamentally changed and brought in line with what other countries have done. What we're proposing to do is abnormal, put bluntly. The only jurisdiction that I'm aware of that has truly achieved 100% fibre is the island of Jersey. Everywhere else, it's a hybrid model, and broadband radio does the rural part of that. So if we were to do it again, we would need to look at, say, for instance, what has been done in the UK. We would need to look at a use it or lose it model of spectrum. We would need to look at what Scotland is doing in terms of they tried to do 100% fibre, digital superfast Scotland broadband scheme. They did very well, but they don't have the same type of development pattern. They have a more cluster development pattern. So they had a very successful fibre rollout, but again, they even concluded that there comes a point where it makes sense to bring in that hybrid approach. So they're really going at it now in terms of the design of that consumer subvention program, which was connection grants, which are technology agnostic. So the ISP can, once they meet the performance criteria, which is what we're talking about, they can use whatever technology they like. They can run fibre to the home, or they can use broadband radio. So in terms of reopening the process, we would need to sort of follow what other countries have done, elected to do, and are doing successfully. And we would need to look at a license-protected model, say, for instance, like France has done. So they've just recently implemented so a license-protected model is you don't auction the license. You simply say, okay, this section of the band is protected, and the only people who can access this band are those that make an application to deliver high-speed rural broadband to premises. And if they don't meet those performance targets, the application is rejected. So it removes that cost burden and allows existing regional ISPs to immediately start solving the problem. Now, by striking that piece of that decision in terms of the license protective model, they immediately opened up 2 million homes to being covered by existing regional ISPs. So in terms of, again, to come back to reopening the process and what we've talked about in our written submission, you would need a license protected model that allocates suitable spectrum. You need some low band and you need some mid band, and you'd need several of the other policy instruments that have been outlined in our written submission to do that, which should be a consumer subvention model to cover those premises that are not commercially viable, and would ideally be a state-backed affordable loan scheme similar to what was done with the agricultural cash flow scheme.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Deputy Eamon Ryan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Smith and others. What you're saying in some ways runs completely contrary to, as I recall, Chair, was it Analysis Mason were in with us and said that they'd never seen any place like Ireland and their international consultants for the ribbon development along roads. And if I'm recalling correctly, what their evidence was is that in working on the National Broadband Plan, they'd come to the conclusion that you couldn't serve Ireland with fixed wireless, rural Ireland. You had to, because the nature of the development was along country roads, it was the only technical way you could do it was to run fibre from each. Now, I suppose it's difficult because we're not technical experts, but you're saying, well, you can do that with a similar non-cable based door-to-door road or house-to-house solution. Who do we believe technically?
So just, I know Martin's going to come in here, but I remember you in the committee the other week saying that. So I was reading through analysis and I've read extensively different reports by Analysis Mason. None of what they've said to you makes sense because they have more documents discussing the importance of wireless technologies for solving the rural broadband. They actually maintain a standing report on what other countries are doing with fixed wireless access technology. So that's a list of countries that they continuously monitor as to how they're using wireless technologies to address rural areas in terms of broadband access. It's quite detailed. And in all of the documentation that you read through, the recommendation is, well, these wireless technologies is the way that you cover rural areas and serve them with high-speed broadband services. I'm not sure why they came in and told you that broadband radio is not the technology.
I think what this says, the topography of when you have a strip of houses along a road, even if you have a mast on a high point on a local school or church or barn or whatever, that it's very difficult to get every house. That the only way you can be certain of it is looping house to house. On I suppose they're not saying it couldn't be done with house to house fixed wireless, or as you say radio, but what they say, as I understand what they're saying, is because you couldn't easily get a high point to cover all the houses along a road because they're behind trees, behind a little hill, turning the road. It's this meandering pattern of development everywhere, which has no concentration of hamlets. It's just road-based housing development, which makes us just completely different to any other country in the world. There's nowhere else in the world that has this roads, frontage, sprawl development model. And they say it's not physically possible to do it with fixed wireless.
I think, should we hear from, you guys deal with this all the time, so let's...
Actually, one thing that I then would put against that is you have over 70 providers registered with a general license with Comrec for wireless broadband transmission. 70. You have over 40 providers that actively are selling wireless broadband in rural Ireland. Why is that when it's not possible?
But I think what they're saying is it's very hard to cover every house.
Yeah, but again, that's a matter of at the end of the day is where as I outlined, most providers go in and they find multiple spots so that they get every angle, and then there's obviously the odd house, and yes, we have come across these that's completely enclosed in trees and you can't do it. But I know of one scenario where the receiver even was put up in the tree.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question, because it's difficult on the technicalities of this. When we're saying radio, it's the radio wave spectrum, and fixed wireless is the same thing. You could use either term, or it's wireless, radio wave. It's all on the invisible microwave spectrum. You said there that the likelihood of next development is in the 700 megahertz spectrum and in the 2 point. You didn't finish that point. What 2 point something gigahertz, I presume?
So we were talking about suitable spectrum bands for implementing the model that we have outlined. And just to briefly track back on Martin's point, in terms of the position we're in now, where we have the odd house which can't be covered, it must be remembered that at the moment, all regional providers are forced to operate in license-exempt bands, which are very noisy. So the spectrum that's been allocated is not the ideal mix. It's very restrictive in what their options are. What we have done in this written submission is outlined the mixture of spectrum bands, which 700 was one of them, which is a low band, which you've heard is for non-line of sight, to deal with trees and to deal with the drumlins and everything else that you need to bounce the signal through to make sure they're getting the 150 megabits per second. And we've outlined in terms of the mid-band. Now, in the mid-band, there's three options. They're in the written submission in the 2 gigahertz band. What you need contiguous blocks of about 100 megahertz per second assigned in a license-protected model. So that is that the only people who can use it are, say, for instance, the regional ISPs. Now, if you implemented that license-protected model and you allocated suitable spectrum bands, such as the ones outlined, a mixture of low and mid, then you're getting into a situation where that lone house is suddenly then covered. Now, what we've done is taken it one step further, and we've said, okay, if you reduced the distances down from the sites and you took a really conservative limit, which in reality you probably would do it over a longer distance, but say for argument's sake you do it at a max distance limit of approximately 6 kilometres. It would be very interesting to see would there be a premise that wasn't covered. From
memory, was that 700 megahertz, was that part of the digital dividend? Was that formerly TV and switched to mobile cellular, or was it?
The 700 megahertz is currently actually occupied by 2RN. It's due to be cleared by March 2020. At that time, we don't know what's actually going to happen. The bandwidth we imagine it's probably going to be auctioned off, but it would be highly significant and useful bandwidth for use for broadband radio, because it could provide coverage, let's call it, to the last 5%, where trees and drumlins and small hills get in the way. And the analogy I'll use, generally, the lower in the frequency you go, the better it penetrates through obstructions. I suppose the analogy I'll use is you're driving from Dublin to Belfast in your car and you're listening to RTE. You start off in Dublin on the DAB digital, which is on a higher frequency. Lovely, good quality, but quite short range, probably 30 to 40 kilometres, which is quite good compared to broadband radio. But as you drive up the coast, you move into areas where the DAB can't cover, and you fall back to VHF, or what we call traditional FM. And that provides coverage to about maybe 60 kilometres from your area, because the frequency is lower and it penetrates again better through obstructions and hills and trees and forests. So we carry on up the motorway and maybe enter Northern Ireland and drive in there, and we go out of range of the FM once we go 60 kilometres in, because the terrain has blocked it, and then we have to move to a lower frequency again, like the AM band or long wave, to continue listening. So just like the analogy is put for that, it can be used similarly for broadband radio, where in the lower the frequency you use, the better the penetration you can get from the broadband radio. At a slight sacrifice of speed, but we only envisage that will be used for the 5% where we cannot service on the mid and high frequencies.
Well, just to explain the technology then, when we hear about LTE or 5G, can you just explain that? Where do you think 5G will fit in that analogy you have, and why? Explain to me what you mean when you say LTE. I mean, I'm familiar with the term, but just to
LTE is classified as 4G, and I think what we're getting on 5G, and I'm not the world's biggest expert on 5G technologies, Garment, but it's a next generation of 4G operating in the mobile allocated bands, probably 3.5, 2,100, and maybe some stuff down at 900. Would I be correct, Marcus?
It is.
Yeah.
So that's a separate thing. That's not what you're talking about in that mix.
So just in terms of all of the 4G, 5G, so that's in the category of mobile communications technology. So it's coming out of the cellular family of specifications. So at the minute, the 5G, when we hear about 5G, it's technically a 5G new radio line of code. So it's a software upgrade to existing 4G technology. Now, your straight up 5G in terms of hardware will be coming later in the year. Very interesting, in the US, Verizon did some trials in terms of rural broadband, or several actually, mobile network operators. They found in the rural regions that the performance increase over 4G was not substantial. And if we go back to the original concept of 5G in terms of its development, where it all started, the idea was to serve high density environments like airport terminals and subway stations. So it started out as, we need to develop a new standard, because everyone now has a mobile phone, and you have scenarios where there are tens of thousands of people in very close proximity to each other. So we need technology that can deliver a large amount of throughput to all of these people in close proximity to each other. It sort of, the scope grew, if you like, as the technology was developed, and it co-opted the rural broadband access issue, and it's since become more associated, funny enough, with the idea of providing rural broadband access than, say, its original impetus for its development. I would sort of finish up by saying simply that in terms of 5G is a technology that, as explained, is not originally in terms of a development track designed for the type of rural broadband that we're talking about, and the type of rural connectivity gap that we have.
Okay.
The technology that's used at the moment by regional ISPs has always been, from its initial concept through its initial development stages through to the finished product, they've always been about long range, connecting multiple premises from a single site, and doing it at the highest speed possible.
Okay. Last question I have, if I can, Chair. In your presentation, you say there's a leaked aid memoir for the department reveals that the winning bidder is to be the retailer of last resort. I don't know if we can get a copy of that, or have you provided it? If you could provide a copy of that.
Clause 19.
Clause 19. I will have. Can I ask? So your 40 regional internet service providers have 125,000 customers. Your expectation is, I suppose, if some of those customers, obviously their house will be passed, they will have the option at a charge of €100 getting the fibre connection, or probably 2% might be alternative means, but the vast majority fibre. What's your expectation? Is it your expectation that do you think that your internet service providers will keep the retail relationship and will just switch typically over to the fibre? Will you migrate that easily from your fixed wireless network to retail through the fibre? And what makes you think, or where's that risk if there isn't sufficient customers that the department would lift the retail restriction? We haven't heard any. They've been fairly clear all along that this has to be open access. I suppose you could have an open access where you also act as a retailer, but Grattan McCourt, the preferred bidder, there's no sense whatsoever that they've infrastructure or the interest in becoming a retail provider. Surely that's not the risk to you. The risk is surely that some other service provider with another retail arm would use the fibre connection to, in a sense, compete with you and take out these small local indigenous companies that have been doing a good job over the last 20 years. Is that not the bigger risk? That's not that the developer will take the business, but that other retailers would do so.
One of the things that we've looked at from the price, the regulated price for open air, for us to use open air, is $23.50, and that's excluding bandwidth, it's excluding VAT, and then over a 12-month contract we have to cover the cost of the connection fee, and we have to cover the cost of a decent wireless router of about €80. So we think at the moment, looking at the pricing, to break even we need to be charging about €50 with no margin. So I'm concerned at the price. We feel that a lot of our customers can justify €45 for broadband access, but much more than that, some customers obviously will. So that's why we're concerned about the take-up of the National Broadband Plan.
Sorry, James, why would you need to have charge a wireless connection charge? Where's that wireless connection occurring?
No, there'll be 23, roughly say it's the same as, let's say the wholesale connection that we will be charged by NBI would be €23, give or take. Then on top of that, we have to provide bandwidth, which is on average, if you take the current average usage, is about €6 per customer. And then we have to provide a wireless router. There will be a connection fee, as far as I'm aware, that we would be...
A wireless router within the house, or...?
Yes.
Okay, right.
Okay, and a decent wireless router, a decent Fritz box or something that will deliver good Wi-Fi through a house is roughly about €80 plus VAT. And then we've to add a margin, and we're not 100% sure if there's going to be a connection fee. I think they're talking about €100 connection fee for a house, and all of that has to be built into a 12-month contract. So our concern then is all these customers won't pay €60 a month plus for their broadband service. So the take-up will be smaller than expected, and then someone will be forced into selling themselves.
And John, ask, where are you serving at the moment, and what's the monthly cost you're charging?
We do a 50 meg service, 50 megabits per second with unlimited usage for €45 a month.
And where is that? In
North Wexford, around the Gorey area.
Thank you.
And we feel that we have a faster service, but people don't. They won't. The take-up is much less.
Thank you.
Deputy Smith might be back. I might bring in Senator O'Reilly. Yeah, next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, to welcome you, and I suppose a question that people will want to know is, who are you representing? Who are your members? I suppose it's a good opening point, if you would just tell us that.
So RISPA was founded by 13 regional ISPs, as I said in the opening statement, to represent the broader industry. There have been previous attempts and successful attempts. There's 2 previous trade associations set up. We were talking about in terms of when the NBP process started, the industry as a whole was very active and spent an inordinate amount of time filling out paperwork and engaging consultations, and much to no avail. So really this time around, in terms of the industry having a third run of it, there was a lot of discussion of, well, we've done all this before and we've submitted all these reports. I mean, in 2015 there was an independent report by the eminent economist Colin McCarthy, and that all went into the department, and again nothing came of it. So in terms of with RISPA, it was a case of those who were willing to go again and to
And you have how many members did you say?
13
providers.
13 providers, yeah.
And do you want to give us the names of those, or do you want to submit them to us?
We can submit them to you if you want. I mean, I probably
would you please?
Just an example of 1 or 2 now.
So obviously the ones I'm joined with today, so Net1, BBNet, Wizzy Internet.
Sorry, could you say them slowly and clearly?
BBNet, Net1, Wizzy Internet, Airwire. We also have high-speed wireless, total wireless. We have Northwest Broadband. We have Wireless Connect, and I'm probably forgetting one or two.
How many of them are indigenous providers, native to this country?
They're all indigenous native
and
providers.
what section of that market of the providers are not in your organisation? Are there many not there now?
So we have about 25%. We've 25% there
of the providers
of the regional ISPs. Yes.
With respects, 25 is small. You know what I mean? But you think it's enough to do what you're proposing to do?
Well, no. I understand actually where the misunderstandings come from. Our written submission is not that RISPA does this in terms of exclusively. The written submission is about how the industry as a whole could do it.
You're assuming in the written submission.
RISPA is just...
But you represent 25%.
RISPA is just an industry representative body designed to gather together research and inputs.
So then a corollary of that, or a lead-on question to that, is these are the fundamental things that people would, I gather we're in public session, so if anyone's watching, they'll want to know this. How many actual broadband customers do your members have in rural Ireland? 20,000. How many?
In terms of the 13 founding members of RISPA, they have 20,000.
20,000. Yeah. Again, yeah. So, next question, if I could. What level of equity would you collectively be prepared to provide for a new project under your proposal? Say, what kind of money are you prepared to put in there?
Well, I think, in terms of the money that's the regional ISPs have always self-financed.
Sorry?
I said the regional ISPs have always self-financed the expansion of their networks, even when the state was subsidising other...
Well, could you put up, do you propose to put up a level of money that would provide a security? Do you know?
In terms of the written proposal, the idea would be that there would be bonded insurance put into it if loans and if connection vouchers were being paid. So,
and otherwise your members would, your providers would carry their own...
They would carry the risk, yes, but there would have to be a rigid compliance programme developed before any money, and it's written into the submission that would have to be developed for any regional ISP to gain access or draw down a loan or a connection voucher. Same as in other jurisdictions.
Okay. So, yeah, and have you consulted Comreg on spectrum requirements? Have you been in touch with them?
No, RISPA has not been in touch with Comreg yet on spectrum allocation. So the policy...
Would you not have, with respects, would that not be fundamental?
Well, procedure dictates that you go through the committees first before then you move on. So we've been focusing on going through the Oireachtas and going through the committees. And it's from the committees that the clerks of the department will return the documentation, as I'm sure you understand. We have a meeting scheduled with the department on the 25th of July. So our focus today was to follow due process in terms of public transparency.
And then you would propose to talk to Comreg.
And then when we meet with the department, we will go from there accordingly. So in terms of spectrum allocation, in terms of changing that policy, there's a very subtle relationship. Comreg obviously have wide scope in the strategies and policies, but it's under advisement from the Minister as to what they look at and investigate. Now, subsection 13 of the Communications Act 2002 allows the Minister of Communications, with permission from the Minister of Finance, to allocate any spectrum band for any justified purpose. He can direct Comreg to do that. So that's something worth noting. It doesn't have to come from Comreg. The Minister of Communications can say, I want this looked at, and I want some sort of a submission regarding how it would be implemented. I want to have something drawn up on this.
And again, a question that's asked, but you answer it in terms of the specific requirements, and at the time, the question arises why you didn't get in previously. So your answer is around the terms of the procurement.
So in terms of the specific reasoning was that in order to submit a wireless proposal, you had to use licensed spectrum. And at the time, and it still is the case, not so much with the 3.5, but at the time when the NBP process started, licensed spectrum was at national auction. So you needed vast sums of money to win that auction, essentially. Now, that's why historically the mobile network operators have always won those auctions, because they have the scale and they're delivering cellular services nationally. What we're saying is that if you look at the trend of other countries, they've realized that those mobile network operators are only using that spectrum really in urban and suburban environments. And what they're doing is they're looking at these regional allocation models, and they're saying, okay, well, if you're not going to use the spectrum in rural regions, what we'll do is we'll have regional auctions for that, or we'll have regional licenses that can allocate that spectrum at a much more affordable rate. So say, for instance, in the UK, if a mobile network operator is not using licensed spectrum in a rural area, a regional ISP can apply for that spectrum and pay 900 sterling for it. I think is that a year or
per year? Yeah.
Per year, yeah. And they can get it for 3 years to deliver it. Now, if the mobile network operator then comes in after 3 years and suddenly they have a huge surge, that they can then take that spectrum back. But it's a much more efficient way of utilising the spectrum, and you get much more people involved in it who can then deliver more services. So
you can see, though, there's a lot of risks. That's all a little bit hazy for, from a government perspective, to provide a service. There can be very little doubt to get it done in time. But, I do see where you cite Colin McCarthy, and that's fair enough. But there's no evidence that you people ever came together collectively in the past or made any effort to submit, quite apart from the fact that if we accept that the procurement process as established was too rigorous or confined or constrained for you to be part of. You didn't lobby, you didn't come to this committee. I, as a public representative, and I don't know about my colleagues, but I suspect I'd hear it anecdotally. You didn't come to us and put an alternative point of view at any point. You're coming in now. It's almost like if my colleague here bought a bad car and I knew it, and I said to him, well, I knew that was a bad car, and he had it already bought, I mean, what I'm saying to you is, why didn't you get him, why were you not more proactive at a critical stage in either forming our opinions, forming the department's view, or, getting in there? It's, why do you come in at this point when
So, I think in terms of engagement with the process, there was extensive engagement with the department amongst various different regional ISPs and through industry representative bodies at the time. And I'm sure boxes of correspondence could be supplied if indeed people were looking for it. We would be happy.
But there's no sign of you making any collective concerted effort at that time to say this process should be different, the terms should be different, and talking to the policymakers. Certainly, I know as a member of this committee, for a long, long time, and I remember when my good colleague who was minister, I was spokesperson in the Senate in this area, and we've done the Broadcasting Act together and lots of stuff. And I'm almost reluctant to say how long I'm on this committee, and nobody ever came to me till now with this. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not saying that I'm far from the solution, but I mean that collectively you should have been talking to us and talking to our political leaders or whatever. Does that make sense?
We were part of an association before ISPI, and also, we were represented by them. I think the Colin McCarthy report was
went to the department in November of 2015.
They certainly made very little impact, and they didn't have us ask department officials questions around our propositions. I must say, hopefully it'll change for you now that you're more organised, but there's no discernible evidence of any input from you, or no track or trace of you trying to change to move the goalposts at all in the past.
Well, I would say that in terms of the actual committee, yes, that the footprint was very light. But in terms of the actual overall engagement of the industry, particularly with the department and Comreg, it's quite extensive, going back quite a long period of time. So I would object to the notion that the industry wasn't actively involved and trying to...
But certainly you accept that the committee was never informed or approached.
I would accept that this committee wasn't engaged.
And I go to my parliamentary party meeting every week, and we're at this stage the largest party. I never remember a discussion, my colleague. I don't recall this a submission from me at that level either. But anyway, that's history. But all I'm attempting to say to you is, you have to bear in mind that it's nearly almost unreasonable at this stage to be doing what you should have been doing a long time ago. But
that doesn't excuse the fact, obviously, that the process has the flaws that it does, and that it requires extremely close scrutiny, and particularly given that the technology has now evolved to a point that we can more cost effectively do it in a shorter period of time.
Moving to those alleged flaws, or what you say, you would accept that Mr. Weckler from the Irish Times is one of the acknowledged professional experts and journalistic commentators.
Is this Adrian Weckler of the...
Yeah.
I wouldn't accept that he's a subject matter expert. No, I don't think anybody here would. He's a technology journalist.
But personally, I would have thought there's a general view that he knows what he's talking about. But anyway, he has said, among others, that to achieve the kind of fairness, as policymakers, we can't make a decision as policymakers. And certainly I would be very negligent, coming from the constituency I come from of Cavan Monaghan, say, if I as a policymaker and coming from Cavan Monaghan, to use that awful cliche, stood idly by while a different system of providing a less sound system of providing broadband to people in very isolated areas was the established system. What I'm saying is that the general view is, from Mr. Weckler among others, and from a lot of technical people, and there was evidence cited earlier, that only through the fibre option can you be absolutely sure beyond year and nay that you've created fairness, that you've created an evenness. And to use that term that I grew up with about the man at the back of the hill, and now the woman and the man at the back of the hill, thankfully, but that people who live in isolated rural areas, that their rights, fairness should be applied to them, their rights. Why should they be put into sort of a two-tier system that, on a wing and a prayer, and on a less secure technology? And when the view is that you need the fibre optic solution, that it's the best solution. I'm not saying that there's not a degree to which other solutions work, and of course you people are a very crucial part of the market, but we're not talking about whether you're in the marketplace or not. Of course you are, and you're very valued people in the marketplace, but what we're talking about here is whether is there a viable, workable alternative to the National Broadband Plan. That's the terms of reference here. And bearing in mind that terms of reference, one must be assuming we cannot have apples and oranges in this situation. It has to be all apples or oranges. In other words, the person in Ballydehob who in an isolated part has to have the same access to broadband and the same, no less good or sound technology, no more questionable or doubtful technology than the person in South Dublin. Do you know what I mean? And that person has to be on a similar footing. In fairness, as policy makers, we can't make an alternative decision. And if we do, people like me are negligent if we acquiesce in a decision that puts our rural people on a different footing.
So just in relation, because your premise of your argument is all about the terms of reference and essentially the quality of service criteria, and that fibre is the
quality, yeah, and lack of doubt, certitude.
So on that point, what's very interesting is that the NBP process and the NBP itself will already have, they say, a 2% component of broadband radio technology. So they've already concluded.
Well, 2% is a very different.
No, hold on a second. No, the broadband radio technology they've already determined meets the terms of reference criteria. So already they have concluded that it can achieve the quality of service criteria to deliver the target specifications of the National Broadband Plan. I would also say that other jurisdictions, in terms of how they've approached
But if they thought that, it would be much greater than 2%. I mean, they're saying that there may be 2% in a doomsday scenario that they won't get to with fibre optic. And in that case, that 2%, that facility is there, that 2% in very, very isolated locations would have to be met.
But we're not talking about the scale of the gap. You were talking about, you were saying that the only way to guarantee the quality of service is through the fibre optic technology. Now, what I'm saying to you...
That's the conventional wisdom.
Right. Well, what I'm saying to you is that already in the process, they've determined that broadband radio technology meets that quality of service criteria. So if the issue is, and it seems to have been the whole way through this in the last 18 months, is that we have to guarantee a certain level, quality of service level. From a purely engineering standpoint of view, and you can ask, use yourself, independent radio engineers and fibre optic engineers, what it comes down to is, will the chosen technology approach achieve the specified quality of service criteria? And the one that can do it more flexibly and can do it more cost efficiently from an engineering point of view is the technology that you go for. So the idea that we have to lay fibre because it's the only way to guarantee the target specification
of the highest speed broadband, to allow the person in the very isolated rural place that they can work, they can do work at home, that they can have education at home, they can access education the same way as anyone else, that they can have access to every service at home, and that they're on a par in terms of home working, in terms of education, in terms of quality of life, in terms of access to entertainment, etc., and in terms of access to the world, that they are on the same standing as somebody in an urban centre. That has to be our policy objective.
Absolutely.
And we are told that the way to do that is fibre. And that's what's inherent in the broadband plan, and hence the extra cost. And I'll come back to that in a minute, the cost, but the certitude is there. And our fear in relation to your plan is that we'd be creating a two-tier world.
Even though, as I said, the technology already meets the top target specification. So it doesn't, the premise of your argument doesn't add up, because it's already going to be part of the NBP implementation. So
it's going to be part for,
there is
possibly for 2%.
And that 2% will become a lot bigger. It'll become a lot bigger.
That's almost Jesuit.
The crux of it is that it already meets the quality of service criteria.
In that technical sense, in that instance.
But that's what matters here.
But if for the generality up to that, for the 98% up to that 2%, you need the fibre.
No, you don't. And look, don't take it from me. Why don't we hear from some subject matter experts? That's what I would say.
Just on that, why have Ayr and Cyro chosen to use fibre in urban areas? Why do they not go for fixed wireless?
Open Air has not used fibre in urban areas. They have used fibre to the cabinet. They're using copper technologies. The 1.7 million premises of their rollout is copper, and of those, a large chunk are sub 30 megabit. On top of that, because there's an issue where some of the copper lines still don't go to the nearest cabinet. They go to the exchange, they go to cabinets miles away, things like that. So that hasn't solved anything. That's why Open Air now turns around, because they have this old legacy network that basically goes 20 years back, or more even than that, but that basically they have basically gone and said, well, the only way we're going to fix this is by now also going fibre. And this is what they do traditionally. Open Air, or Aircom in its traditional sense, actually also always had a nationwide 3.5 gigahertz license. They have run WiMAX trials, they've had customers on WiMAX, they've never ran the product as because they are traditional telecoms company. What you have to look at, Cyro on the other hand, again, Cyro is sprung out of ESP telecoms. Well, no, sorry, out of ESP networks. So they're using ESP networks power lines, and they've basically the easiest way for them is that was basically fibre, and it is down to the scalability with that. Again, this is all urban. What we're talking about here is National Broadband Plan. This is all rural, but this is all urban when it's Cyro. Cyro has nothing in as such rural scenarios. It's all cities, town, villages to a certain extent. And it makes a whole lot of sense with fibre there, because if you run with radio links and you don't have the spectrum to run non-line of sight, well, then you have houses in the way everywhere in an urban scenario. You would need non-line of sight spectrum, and you would need a lot of it to do it. Which is what the mobile broadband, the mobile network operators, what they do. But even they, if you look at in an urban scenario, very often, even though you have a 4G signal, you don't have a lot of bandwidth in cases, because there's just too many people and there's not enough spectrum.
Sorry, I interrupted your.
No. I'm two issues away from finish, but this next issue is one that human reality, and again as policymakers we can't avoid, and we've had a number of this. We have this huge campaign in Cavan at the moment around the undergrounding versus the overgrounding of the cables, the north-south interconnector. And we have the NIMBY syndrome all over Ireland. And with, the not in my back garden, and it's a grand in the abstract. And of course, people feel an unfairness. Why are all these things lumped out in the sticks? They look upon it, all these masts, etc. And you're going to need, I think it's, you'd accept, I mean, we can argue maybe about the actual figure, but you're going to need up to 6,000 masts all over Ireland to achieve your objectives.
795 in the document. We put in a very accurate calculation model.
I was advised by people that it would be more, but let's even say...
That comes from Adrian Weckler, because he's focused on 5G, which, as we've explained, is the mobile communications technology. That would require far greater number of sites.
Yeah, well, it's
795.
Here's our problem. See, there is just to put it, for you to see our problem, that's the part we see, yours too, and it has been noted and will be part of our ultimate conclusions. But you have to see our difficulty now. There is a political and a policy and a human rights imperative to get broadband to every home in the country very fast, very quickly. And under the Constitution, even from a legalistic point of view, every citizen has to be cherished equally. But whether you look at it constitutionally, whether you look at it on education, you look at the Price Waterhouse Cooper, the PwC assessment of the good that broadband will do, and that putting the broadband plan in place will do is such a range of things, from home working right across.
Those benefits have been questioned by Robert Watt.
Well, I wouldn't, as a resident of rural...
He said that the CBA lacks...
No, well, as a resident of rural Ireland, I believe in those benefits, and I believe my people have a right to them. So,
I didn't say that they don't have a right to them.
Yeah, my question is, they have a right to everybody in this country.
But the benefits outlined They lack credibility. Is what the top civil servant whose job it is to make that determination. That
no,
the cross-benefit analysis
everybody in the country has
credibility.
the same right to this service. So my question is this. Given that there will be, even with 795, and that's, as you said, there's a dispute around that figure, but let's take that figure, 795 masts. By the time you got them established, but get the protests over, the whole, and all the civil disobedience and civil strife that will arise in the putting of them, by the time you, I mean, you know, there'll be new technology almost. Do you know what I mean? It takes ages, because were you to say hypothetically put a mast, to seek to put a mast in an area tomorrow, you could have protests, you could have physical sit-ins.
Were you listening to, I have to ask, were you listening to the delegation? Because we made it very clear how the technology works, that it doesn't require mast sites. So
you're saying it won't even need the 795 then?
No, you're misunderstanding that a site doesn't necessarily have a mast on it. A site can.
Well, how many masts do you think you'll have then?
Not 795. And as James has said here, most of those sites are already active.
See, our problem politically is that if you have any, it's not that we have a problem maybe confronting the issue of the mass per se, but our difficulty is that the process will go on and go on and go on, and that we won't get the broadband into them.
I'm going to let John come in here.
Yeah, just.
I think the concern here that comes on itself is around the masts, planning, objections. We had Comreg, just to explain where Senator O'Reilly's coming from, and this would have been raised at a number of times over our hearings, that Comreg have said to us, and they are the trusted, I suppose, independent body, they have said that we'd need 6,000 masts to deliver 5G. And I take your point in relation to what you're proposing, something completely different to 5G. And the Plum report also said that fixed wireless operators would require 4,000 to 5,000 masts as well. So if you're proposing masts, we need, I suppose, clarity around how many, the planning issues that would surround that, the time frame in relation to erecting those masts, and just more clarity about that. It's just, I think we need that understanding here.
And how will this delay the whole process then? But if you want to make a written submission on that, it's fine, but if you, or make a comment first.
I'll make a reference comment with regard to your own constituency of Cavan Monaghan, which I'm very familiar with. Our company serves it. We currently are rolling out our what we call our next generation service, is a 50 megabit plus service. We have 19 sites at the moment across Cavan and Monaghan. 19 sites. They could be on farmers' sheds. They could be on the side of a pole on in a haggard or a yard. They could be on hills, like some of them up in Slieve Glah, where there is a mast in Cavan. From those 19 sites in Cavan Monaghan, we have close to 4,000 rural customers at this time in your own constituency. And with regard to the penetration and the getting it, we have recently obtained a test and trial licence from Comreg to operate on the 700 megahertz low band. I think you were there yourself at the launch in Chaddisk in Ballyhaise back last month, Senator. So that project is...
See, I'm not... I just want to make this very clear, but I do have another question. We're not questioning the efficacy of your service, the merit of what you do, far from it, and I think you need support, and what you do is important. And that day in Ballyhaise was exciting and wonderful, and the more it does, the better. That's not the issue here. Our issue here is this a viable alternative to the National Broadband Plan? And that's what our report will have to deal with specifically. While, of course, your service is efficacious and does great good, and of course there are beneficiaries, and I know them, and of course I support that. But the question is, can you jump from that to assume that you deliver the entire national broadband service?
Scalability. Well, I don't think RISPA are advocating that RISPA do that. What we're putting through here today is an alternative argument for how the speeds that are set out can be achieved in an alternative way, which costs the state less money.
I'll move then, Chair, to a last issue. And it's one that's kind of very relevant to people who are presumably watching this or going to read about it in print media tomorrow. You make the point there that in your own written submission, so I'm not reading anything in it, you say that the projected cost of the initiative has spiraled to 2.97 billion. we were led to understand from a number of other witnesses to this committee and from the department, etc., that we'll be getting the VAT back, which is over 300 million, which accept that. So that reduces by, say up to 350 million on the VAT. There's also within that 297 a figure of 527 million approximately that's put there to avoid a scenario that we've all been reading about recently in another big project in this country, to avoid a risk of escalating costs, that 527 million is put in as a cushion so that it may go up or go down, but that it will not go above the 297. But the likelihood is, with good management and with the very rigorous protocols and control of the department, that 527 would be avoided. So that takes us back nearer the 2 billion figure. And then thirdly, isn't it the case that there's a clawback facility assuming a high take-up? And I think there will be a high take-up. I think, you know, when the ESB started to light up the homes of the hills of Donegal, among other places.
Say Robert Watts, the memorandum from the department, they strongly believe that the uptake would not be high.
I think it will. I think that as
already finished.
just to finish the point, that as we go on, I will finish now, and I'm happy that I know, and I'm happy to finish in the next thing. That as we go on into the process, and as Ireland is evolving and changing, who would have thought that we'd all have a couple of mobile phones 20 years ago? Who would have thought that when the ESB started that everyone would want electricity supply, when in fact people thought it was almost, they were afraid of it at the outset. So this will change, and there will be an enormous take-up, and this is the future. And that's why you have a commercial imperative, and everybody has a commercial. We have a political imperative, you have a commercial imperative. Everyone has an imperative to get this right. So it's going to go. So in summary, I'm saying that the 2.97 billion figure is not correct because of the VAT, because of the cushion that's put in of over 5 million there to allow for escalating costs that we don't anticipate will happen, and because of the clawback. So that in fact, realistically, the figure could fall a little below 2 billion. And oh, by the way, when you mentioned there won't be a take-up, in the UK, we were told, one of the witnesses told us here, that the take-up was exponentially, hugely greater than was anticipated. Do you know? So look, I'm finished at that, but just to put that to you, that figure is not the correct figure.
So in relation to that figure, obviously you said we have to compare apples with apples and not apples with oranges. So our headline figures are the maximum worst case scenario in terms of we built the model with an incredible amount of redundancy. So, I mean, obviously you can talk about clawbacks and you can talk about success rates, but that's like reading tea leaves as to what the future is going to be like. You have to take the headline figure, the top figure, and you have to presume that it could go that way, the same way that we picked figures and presumed that, you know, it could be up to 500 million in terms of a loan scheme. It could be up to 412 million in connection vouchers. That's the way, in terms of public policy planning, you've got to look at that. So, okay, fine, yeah, you'll have clawbacks and you have all these other mechanisms, but you don't know exactly how it's going to come down. I think the bottom line is you're talking in billions and we're talking in millions. And I think it's quite disturbing to me as a citizen that you would not be more prudent in terms of examining the information and reading through it in much greater detail in terms of the arguments that have been laid out here. If we're talking about saving the country, those large sums of money, I think that...
And we're questioning the proposition, as is our duty.
And that's perfectly fine, but I think to come out, for subject matter experts to come out and to give the evidence that they have for the written submission to be talking of what it is talking about in terms of a plan, the credibility and the numbers, it warrants serious examination.
We did with the other witnesses too on all sides. We had a similar set of questioning because the report has to reflect that.
Just to go back over that, you said, I think you said it was 19 sites, is it, in Cavan?
19 sites in Cavan and Monaghan, most of those small, what we call micro-sites with something like what Cormac has demonstrated
And
here.
that would cover how many premises? About 4,000?
Pretty close to 4,000 customers in those two counties.
So if you're trying to then cover 5,400 customers, you're talking about over like 2,500 sites.
The model that we're using at the moment is, with regard to our current business model, is that we go at a 15-kilometre radius, because we've set the bar at 40 to 50 meg, which was what was specified as the NGA speeds at that time when we designed the network. Of those sites, the 19 sites, there'll be 3 of them main mast sites where we pay rental and put our dishes on them on elevated hills and mountains. The rest of them would be micro-sites which we've built ourselves. So it's
and
basically...
would there be planning permission required for those micro-sites?
Planning exempt, because it's just on the side of a building, an antenna like that.
Just to say, to clear up the confusion, you can load multiple base stations onto a site. So what we're talking about in our model is we're talking about maybe 8 of these units per site. That's how we're able to cover the density of in terms of the interconnection.
So in the Cavan Monaghan area, you're talking about 3 masts, like what Comreg have identified. They said for 5G it needs 6,000 across the country. So in relation to what, I just want to make sure that people can understand, when you're talking about masts, we know, are you talking about what Comreg is talking about? Because they have given us advice in relation to 5G or wireless, and you're saying that and you're just talking about Cavan Monaghan, you're saying 3 masts
I'm talking 3
per what Comreg would be talking about. Am I correct in that?
Well,
Sorry,
you see,
to clarify what I'm asking.
we would refer to it from our perspective as sites. So a site would contain a broadband radio capable of giving service to 50, 55 people. So one of those units there would service 55 people. We can put up to 8 of those on a site. Now, most of those sites are reasonably local and rural, and we come to agreements with farmers to service the local area, and they're coming to us on a day-to-day basis. Can we get some figures to get people in our area? There is no broadband.
And in relation to the larger masts, what Comreg are talking about in relation to the rollout of 5G, they're talking about 6,000 across the country. How many of those kind of masts are you talking about for your proposal? Just so we can understand.
In Cavan Monaghan, we utilise 3 telecommunication masts, systems like that. They're on Slieve Gla, Corcahan and Slieve and Erin over the west towards the Leitrim border.
So, and that's part of the 4,000, is it 4,000? That's
4,000
with your
customers,
smaller, with your smaller, what I would call a mast as well. So that's just for 2 counties. So then we're looking at 540,000. We're looking at a lot more masts across the country. But you don't have an exact figure on that.
No, the 3 masts that you're talking about, were you...
Can I just... what this...
Sorry, the 3 masts...
Mr. Matthews,
the 3 masts were not built by Net1. They house communications technologies from multiple different companies.
I know, but in your proposal, if you're saying that you're going to roll out broadband across the country to 540,000 people, and Comreg have told us, and they are the independent, a trusted advisor who have come before us and have, I suppose, a credible reputation in relation to this and have, I suppose, advised us. So we want to know exactly how many masts you're proposing, because the complexity, as has been outlined by many people here around planning, around, many people who, we know the whole situation around even our mobile reception in some areas of the country. We are contacted by constituents and we say, you actually need a mast in that area, but there is an objection to putting up a mast for mobile. So these are the political complexities in relation to this. That's why there is there was a lot of questions here in relation to exactly what you're proposing here in relation to the rollout of masts, the planning, the complexities, that it's not oversimplified. I suppose that's our concern.
In terms of the model that we built, the reason why we put in such a small distance limiter was so that we wouldn't have to build masts if the proposal was to be adopted and examined.
So you're not going to build any masts as part of your proposal?
Nobody wants masts. As has been discussed, there's NIMBYs, there's objections. By utilising this technology, as has been described by subject matter experts here, you can put it on existing premises, you can even put it in a tree, as Martin described. What matters is the distance the length of the connections. Now, if you reduce those distances down, then you don't have to deal in masts.
At all. So are you proposing not to have any masts?
We would be proposing to have as close to 0 masts as possible. There may be, you might have to build 20.
With wireless?
With this technology.
Yeah, wireless,
here,
not
broadband
fibre,
radio.
not fibre.
Well, the key part is that you'd have to do fibre extensions. You'd have to bring fibre into certain rural areas. But say, for instance, if you took somewhere like Wicklow, I think we were discussing, you might do 4 fibre extensions for the whole county, and then you would use broadband radio to connect all of the, in terms of the last mile network. So rather than running fibre and digging up every road and digging up every town and running fibre everywhere, you extend the fibre where it makes sense, and then you use a flexible technology which meets the target exceeds the target specification proposed in the NBP to deliver the services. So in terms of coming back to your original question, the number of masts, masts are not desirable. The model was built in such a way that we wouldn't be getting into the sorts of numbers that, 6,000 masts. I think, John, we were looking at something if across the whole country it could be, 20, 30 mast sites.
Large that probably exist at the moment, and we'd rent space through those.
So you would use the existing masts. You can roll out wireless using the existing masts in the country. Am I correct on that? With your proposal?
Provided the distance limitation is adhered to that we specified. That's why you don't have to use that mast infrastructure. Because the reason you're using the mast infrastructure is you're trying to get cover huge distances and get a load of properties in the coverage arc from the unit. But if you reduce down that distance, then what you can do is you can locate them in a more targeted way. You're getting less total premises that you can cover, but you're giving a much higher quality of service, and it's much more flexible, and you're avoiding then having to deal with masts.
And just finally, just to get clarity in relation to the speeds there, I know you mentioned this earlier, just the National Broadband Ireland are talking about a starting speed of 150 megabits, rising to 500 megabits with a 1 gigabit option availability immediately for businesses. Is that not a good option for businesses out there across Ireland, that they would have these levels of speeds?
Two things on this point I would like addressed. One is that the technology can't meet that 150 megabit target, and the other
Which technology?
That broadband radio can't meet
your own technology that you're proposing.
Yeah, that it doesn't meet the red lines, and I think you can obviously comment on the technicalities if you like on that. The other one is obviously in terms of the gigabit connections, and I know all of the companies here provide wirelessly extremely high speed connections of a gigabit plus. You can provide up to 10 gigabits per second with broadband radio technology. So businesses that want that type of connectivity already have it and have had it for a very long period of time. The reality is that, as has been discussed, and I'm in this category, I could have a 150 megabit connection if I want. I do teleconferencing or work from home.
There are lots of businesses across the country who don't have it, and that's our problem across rural Ireland, and that's what the National Broadband Ireland are offering.
But
so to say that they have it if they want it is the whole reason why we want the role of the National Broadband Plan, because there are many businesses in rural Ireland, in the regions, who don't have access. It's not commercially viable, and this is the reason why we're rolling this out. But you're saying you don't have those same, you can't offer the same speeds as National Broadband Ireland.
I'm saying already for many years, businesses that require that level of connectivity have had it. So, and more than 1 gigabit per second.
So you're saying there's no need for that businesses in rural Ireland at the moment can access it now?
The statement was that it starts at 150 megabits per second, it'll go to 500, and it goes up to a gigabit per second services. What I'm saying is that existing, and has been the case for many years, and some of the members of the delegation can attest to this if they like, that businesses who require multi-gigabit connectivity have had it for some time because they need it. Now, if you're talking about private households, then the question comes into how many of them are actually taking multi-gigabit services. And we had discussion earlier about that the uptake beyond entry-level connections is very low. The technology already is there, and subscriptions are available if people want 50 and 100 megabits to their home. I could have 150 megabits now if I wanted to. I don't need it at all. I may need it in the future, at which point the technology will have moved further again. So we have to kind of look to see, well, who needs that level of connectivity and when do we need it? That's what I'd be saying.
And I suppose at the moment it's in relation to businesses, it's about empowering businesses and rolling it out into the regions and ensuring that people can have it, so they don't have to move to it, they don't have to be in the city, they can have it out in the regions. I suppose that's the whole point of the National Broadband Plan. Deputy Lawless, did you want to get in? Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. If the Senator wants to come in for a
Okay, very
I'm
briefly.
only finishing, Deputy Lawless, and then just two quick finishes. I suppose what struck me when you were going through what you have and the number of sites you use now and the number of masts is, that's great and wonderful, but it's for a certain level of service. This is talking about 540, you know, say you do 4,000 in Cappamona now, it'll be very different then, but anyway, that's point is covered for the moment. So we have to draw out these because these are all questions for the report. According to Comreg, if you were to increase the geographic outdoor mobile coverage of 30 megabytes per second from, at the moment, 18.3% premises have it, and if you were to bring that up to 99.5% geographical coverage, so you were to get the whole country in, basically, Comreg are putting a price on that would cost they're putting a price of 1860 billion on that, and according to Comreg, and 5910 new sites. This is from Comreg's evidence. How would you react to that? If I'm misrepresenting Comreg, I accept that I am, but I don't think so.
Are you referring to mobile coverage, Senator?
Yeah.
I think possibly, I haven't seen the Comreg report, but it may be referring to microwave bands or high microwave 60 gigahertz bands with a range of very, in the region of hundreds of metres to give those very, very high speeds. I think we've seen the BBC demo that was done in London there a couple of weeks ago with the launch of the EE 5G trials, where the reporter had to sit with the phone going in a certain direction like this to actually get it because the coverage was so small and was reflecting off buildings. So I think perhaps it's maybe something akin to that Comreg are referring to. I'm not sure because I haven't seen it, Senator.
I think the key is what you're saying in terms of mobile communications technology is the problem here. And there's an issue that is the same as, say, the technology that is used by regional ISPs, and it's not. So in terms of the cost and in terms of the number of sites, I have no doubt that that's accurate if it was to be done via 5G. But we're not talking about 5G. We're talking about a technology that's been purposefully designed and has been used for 20 years to deliver connectivity in remote and rural regions across the world. So
one thing in regards to the figures, just to basically justify, you're talking 540,000 premises. That's a figure premises passed that the National Broadband Plan wants to achieve. When we're talking 4,000 to 5,000 premises that Net1 covers in Monaghan, Leitrim, in that area up there, that's 4,000 to 5,000 premises actually subscribed who have also competition from ADSL, from older copper technologies, from mobile broadband, from other parts. So not every household in that coverage is subscribed with his service. So it's apples and oranges again, because you have one thing is uptake and you have one thing that's premises passed. So you can't just go and say like the 4,000 to 5,000 doesn't scale to the 540,000 nationwide, because you have to consider uptake. Also in regards to previously where you said you expect a high uptake in the National Broadband Plan, even Open Air with the 300k rollout didn't have a very high uptake because they didn't anticipate that, for example, we are already covering a lot of these customers who didn't move because we could give them an adequate service.
Okay.
Or who weren't interested in paying the civils needed to get the line into the property.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just on that point, it's quite interesting that regional ISPs have maintained their customer numbers in spite of the fibre optic rollout of AIR's 300 intervention. That was something we were discussing the other week. It was quite quite intriguing. So that you can only come to one conclusion in that as the number of premises, and it's reckoned about 14% of premises passed during that ERA rollout, took up that service. Obviously, they would have been taking them predominantly from regional ISPs. The only way for regional ISPs, therefore, to maintain their numbers would have been to extend their networks into areas that weren't being served and acquire new customers. So it shows quite a level of ingenuity on the part of regional ISPs that they're continuously adding customers to their businesses in terms of serving areas that aren't served. So,
Pretty lawless. I'm going to bring you in now. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the guests and witnesses today. Just reading I missed your presentation. I was in another meeting, but I read your pitch and your proposal to the submission as well. And I have a lot of sympathy for the approach being proposed for a number of reasons. One, because I have worked in my own constituency with a number of providers for a number of years before the NBP. Well, actually, sorry, not before, because the NBP has been around as long as I've been in active politics. Not delivered, but certainly doing the rounds. But I've worked with lots of different ISPs and seen lots of different approaches. I've also worked with communities where maybe more technical proficient members of a community group, I suppose, did various ad hoc approaches and tried to improvise themselves with varying degrees of success. So I know for a fact and from experience that there can be multiple ways to achieve broadband penetration into rural areas, not just fibre, but there are many different technologies which work reasonably well. And as one of the bugbears I've had with the NBP that wasn't tried in further greater measure, and it's one thing I've said many times in this committee, and I've said it in the Dáil, and I've published legislation on it. I knew the former Minister, Dennis Naughton, agreed with my legislation in large. And I suppose what I've said in drafting a bill and in various different testimonies like this is it seems to me sometimes that we're trying to do this the wrong way around, that we have an issue where we are subsidising the winner of the tender to go into all the intervention areas and pay them a whack load of money to go in and provide internet to areas that can't get it. And really, rather than saying, well, we accept that as a given and we're going to give somebody the subsidy to go and do it, we should be saying, well, why is it not happening already? Why is there market failure? Understand the reasons for the market failure, tackle those reasons and their planning anomalies and their regulatory anomalies, their sharing of site anomalies. There are all sorts of things which have been inventorised in various task lists over the last number of years of different committees, and I've tried to tackle some of them in my legislation. But rather than saying, let's fix all those issues and those gripes and gotchas and glitches, and then have a look and see if the intervention area gets smaller, which I think it invariably would, we've taken an approach to say, there's a big black hole over here, let's fill it with loads of money and give that to someone to go and do that. So I think, I say I have a lot of sympathy, and just reading your proposal, and again I agree with many of the points you made, that I'm not convinced we're getting economies of scale, with the current approach, but by giving one tender a paycheck to go and do it, we're not allowing for improvement in technology. We're not allowing for. There's no incentive to improve the process. There's no incentive to say, well, here's a glitch because two different local area plans side by side in two different counties which are on the same border actually have competing area plans. There's no incentive to say, let's take the site sharing possibility, and instead of saying let's have a common mast and reused by many providers, everyone puts up their own. And there's no incentive to say that ducting that's running on the side of a motorway, actually I understand it's cheaper to dig up the road and put in a new ducting rather than actually reuse the one that's already there, because the rates that the Department of Public Expenditure charge for access to ducting on the motorways. So all these kind of crazy gotchas, there's no incentive to tackle them because we're going to give some loads of money to go and do it regardless. So I have a lot of issues with the proposed approach. So as I say, I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying. Just to understand, so coming down to your own proposals and your own approach, to understand I have it right, what you seem to be saying, if I'm reading it correctly, is that you're saying pretty much what I just said, and you're saying there's a different way we can do it. And one of the ways that you're saying we can do it is by, and I suppose there is a compromise of sorts, because you're saying we won't give fibre to every home, if I have it right. You're saying that we will provide a variety of technologies, primarily broadband radio, I think, from your submission, but maybe other technologies as well. Maybe there's a degree of fibre with last mile via radio, maybe a bit of 5G in the mix, I think, as well. No, maybe not. Okay, but so primarily broadband radio, fixed wireless, and you're saying that we'll do that and we'll have a sort of minimum standard of 150 megabits per second, I think is what you're saying, and that will be delivered in 2 years for 402 million, which seems extraordinarily good value for money, and an extraordinarily attractive proposition. So I suppose I'm coming at it from the point of view that I'm extremely sympathetic. and it does bear out my own experience, direct experience, as a councillor and then as a TD, working with companies in my own area, and working with local authorities and all the rest of it. But I suppose it comes around to, if something's too good to be true, it often is. It normally is. And I suppose, I'd love to think this was the way forward. And, I say, I've lots of reasons that it might be. But if it was so obvious, how come it's not happening? Can you answer that?
I mean, I suppose that's how I ended up becoming involved really in this, is I just couldn't believe when the connection was installed. I didn't believe it. And it was James here in his company who did it. And I mean, I was on ADSL for years and it was dreadful. And he said, oh yeah, I can probably, how much speed would you like? And I was kind of saying, well, can I get the internet? Can it work and not drop every 2 minutes? And could I get like a megabit? And he's like, well, do you want 50? And I was thinking this is not going to work. It's going to take weeks to get done. And I came up one afternoon and 2 hours it was installed, and I've never had to phone the company for any issue, nothing of any technical nature. I do web conferences with the high definition video link with over 40 participants and all the bells and whistles. It can be rain, hail, snow, fog, you can't even see the gate, doesn't make a difference. And I then obviously heard about the NBP, and I just was sitting there going, this does not make sense at all. And before long, I was involved in putting my public policy experience and other various skill sets to good use. And as said in the submission, there's case studies, there's figures given, particularly in relation to Scotland, which tried the 100% fibre approach, and they got very good value for money with that at 442 million. They have a top-up now, which is going to catch the last 5%. But again, I think in terms of too good to be true, I suppose if we look at other jurisdictions, they're bringing it in for this kind of efficiency and economies of scale. So in relation to the question of why it was never raised before, I think there is numerous consultation engagements by the industry down through the years. There's plenty of people who will attest to that and will provide evidence and documentation. There's 2 previous representative bodies that collectively engaged also. So I suppose that the idea that it's just appearing now is, you could say that it's just appearing to this committee at a late stage. Now that I would simply put it down to a lack of communication, I suppose, between maybe the Oireachtas and the department, and also perhaps on the part of the industry not understanding. I mean, these people are working very hard serving customers. I mean, it shouldn't be on them to have to shout this loud to get heard. It's quite remarkable in terms of, from my perspective, in terms of public policy engagement, it's worrying that this was not the alternative that was examined as part of the cost. The criteria for a cost-benefit analysis, the public spending code requires you look at your project, you look at an alternative, and you prepare a counterfactual that extrapolates what will happen if you do nothing in terms of how will broadband access provision progress. So we didn't really look at an alternative. The counterfactual had substantial issues by virtue of obviously 300,000 properties had to be removed, and we've 2 extremely eminent economists basically saying that it doesn't live up to those stress tests. So, yeah, I think we are where we are. There's a tender process running. We do tenders for a reason, to try and tease out problems, to try and prevent us from making bad decisions in terms of allocation of precious public funds. The process, in one respect, has worked in terms of a very credible proposal has come forward. It is in time that we can look at it. We can halt the current process by 2 or 3 months. We can run a national mapping exercise. I'm sure all the regional ISPs are very happy to provide their mapping data, and we were actually looking at a piece of software last week that probably will allow us to do that mapping exercise and instantaneously figure out how many homes are actually covered for next generation access speeds and how many need some type of assistance. So too good to be true. I mean, I would be of the opinion, well, let's put it to the test. Let's really stress test it before we make this decision and go forward with the biggest contract in our history. If we can achieve the exact same result in a faster timescale for significantly less money, we have a duty, the government has a fiduciary duty to examine that in great detail and really robustly determine what is the best course of action.
We're just trying to wrap up here. If you have another question briefly.
With a quick follow-up question. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. I suppose following on from that, and in terms of putting it to the test, to what extent have you or the providers that you represent managed to penetrate into some of those areas already? And if you have you degrees of success, you know, in terms of, because I mean, to an extent we've had an experiment running for the last number of years, and you know, if your group has managed to go into certain areas and actually provide, you know, in a viable way, and in a way that's actually worthwhile for the company as well, well, that's a success story in itself. I suppose, and if you have managed to do that, are there things like some of the glitches and gotchas that I mentioned that could be removed quickly that would enable you to do that, which would, I think, turn the conversation in its
brief answer on that. Thank you.
The answer is yes, there are. We've outlined again some of what would be required. We've talked about obviously the costs. Wholesale access backhaul is a major problem. You made the point. In a lot of cases, it's cheaper to actually take the road than to buy it. So, you know, that would be a core issue that would have to be corrected. And obviously, we're looking to wrap up. But the subject matter experts here could tell you a lot about that and how that works and how it doesn't work compared to other countries. It's very clear that we need to look at a regulated pricing model, and for backhaul providers that are owned by the state, directly or indirectly, whatever way you want to call it, we really need to look at implementing a ratcheting mechanism to drive down those costs over a period of time. And we could tie that with an investment into those companies so that on the balance of it, you know, shareholders are not losing out. We avoid those types of problems, and we get a good quality series of fibre extensions, and we get a good scenario where obviously regional ISPs can instantaneously start delivering more connectivity. I think that would be a core area in terms of the behind the scenes, in terms of the issues that you're talking about. There are other stuff like communications timelines in terms of different state entities. We probably need to establish a communications management strategy. That's not in the written submission, but things like, say, for instance, if there's a fault or an issue, say, for instance, there's you know, radio interference from a different company. You know, it's on Comreg to say enforce that the law and come out and say, well, look, you can't just put that up there and start interfering with pre-existing equipment and other businesses. So these types of things can take very long, and this is a frustration for regional ISPs in the industry, because then their customers are like, hang on a second, why is my service suddenly slowed down? And it's no good. Like so these people saying, well, I can do nothing about it because I'm not the law. I can't go in and enforce the law. So there are a lot of nooks that need fixing behind the scenes, for sure. But we could be here all day talking about them.
Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So we might conclude there. So thank you for coming in to us this afternoon. So the Joint Committee stands adjourned until 2 p.m. on the 23rd of July. Thank you.